Hey, CJ 3400. There's a crime students. Guess what? This is the last video for the semester, and what it does is basically summarize everything. Now, your final PowerPoint presentation is called Integrated Systems Theory. And what you're going to see in here is first a review of everything we learned about integrated systems back in chapter 3. So definitely check those notes out again. They're actually the same as these, with the exception of some new additions at the end. Okay, and then you're going to see 3 versions of this theory. So here's the story. Integrated systems perspective is a perspective I learned about in grad school under C. Ray Jeffrey and Fred Faust, 2 professors I had in criminology. Okay, and they had borrowed this idea from biology and other sciences, this integrated systems perspective, and they were the first to apply it to criminology and crime. But they never actually developed a theory. So they said, your job is to take this and build on it and develop a theory. So that's what I did, and I did it by teaching this class over years and years and years. Okay, so the version of the theory that you see in your book is the second version of it. A third version of it has been produced. Since then, it's in this PowerPoint presentation, okay? So that's just a quick background. So you'll see if you go through the PowerPoint slideshow, you'll see the levels of analysis, again, that we talked about, and each of those is analyzed independently. The final chapter of your book puts those all together, integrates them using integrated systems perspective. Then you'll see the logic of integrated systems in terms of internal risk factors impacting you and external risk factors impacting you. And those things, again, impact each other because they're part of each other, those different levels. The result of all of this is your behavior, whether it's criminal or not. Then you'll see in your PowerPoint slideshow, you'll see both the layman's terms and the integrated systems terms about how things inside you impact you and things outside you impact you. And then finally, it's the interaction of all these things that make your behavior happen, like I said. Okay, so remember, the final point in terms of how integrated systems work is you take any risk factor, whether it be poor parenting or poverty or poor nutrition or what have you, hanging out with friends, on and on and on, all the things that we talked about. And whether they actually impact you depends upon how frequently you interact with them. The more number of times you do it, the more likely it will impact you. The duration of that exposure, that's the length of that exposure, right? The regularity of it, we talked about that pattern of exposure. How strong the risk factor is itself, that's called intensity. And then the priority of exposure is how early in your life. If you recall, the earlier in your life you're exposed to something, the more likely it will impact you, right? And then, in terms of crime prevention, you can counteract the impact of risk factors by protective factors, particularly if you're exposed to them a lot and if they're strong, etc., right? Using those same contingencies we talked about. Now, that's the perspective. That's just a review. What does it look like if you put that into a theory? The original theory that you'll see in your PowerPoint slideshow, it's slide number 9 of this slideshow, you'll see what it originally looks like, and you'll see a bunch of arrows, and it looks crazy. Each of those arrows is meant to represent a relationship that's been discussed in the class and that's been identified in your book, okay? And a couple things I'll point out about this. First of all, if you go to your far left, that's where it starts, genetics. That's the first thing that impacts you is you inherit genes, okay? So you roughly read this from left to right. And each of these relationships, the arrows represent something we talked about. So the first one is genes impact your brain chemistry. They affect your hormone levels in your body. They affect your neurotransmitter levels in your brain, enzymes in your brain. You follow that over to the right, you'll see early antisocial behavior. So that alone, having abnormal hormone levels and neurotransmitter levels, can put someone at risk for early antisocial behavior. Okay, so that's how it works. And every other arrow that points to that is something that we identified as being a risk factor for antisocial behavior, violence, crime, etc. Now, the other thing to note in this slide is if you go all the way to the right, it says continued antisocial behavior. So this theory is meant to explain not only why people start committing antisocial behavior, but also why they continue, because everyone is antisocial, right? And you remember there's differences between early starters and late starters in terms of the risk factors. Most of us are late starters. We start in adolescence, so we're adolescent limited offenders, if you remember that term. Early starters start early as children and they're considered abnormal. Something happened early in their life. But whether someone continues depends on different institutions. So you'll see employment problems, relationship problems, peer associations. Those are institutions in society: job, school, friends, okay, relationships. Um, if you start committing antisocial behavior, this is probably going to mean you're going to start hanging out with antisocial people. So, consistent with chapter 7, peer influences reinforce what you're doing. So, you'll get reward for doing it and continue to do it. Well, that's going to mean you're more likely to continue antisocial behavior if you're hanging out with antisocial people. But also, you're probably going to have problems at work or not have a job. You're probably going to have problems at school or drop out. And you're probably going to have some problems in your relationships, particularly at home with your parents. So these are things that will make these kinds of problems in those institutions means that the antisocial behavior is likely to continue. Okay, so that's what this chart is meant to describe visually, to show all the relationships that are identified in the book and in the class, just visually, so you can see how complex it is. This means there's a lot of things that impact your behavior, from the cell level all the way up to society level. Now you'll see some reactions to it, and this is just for fun. But when you look through the slides, this is what criminologists said when they read the theory. And I'm not going to read them here, but you just flip through the next few slides, and you'll see some really nice things that criminologists said about the theory. Well, the most incredible thing that happened was I was going to a conference in Seattle, Washington, I believe, and I got contacted by Danish national television. What? They wanted to come and film me and do a documentary about my theory. That's crazy, right? So I asked them why, and they said, well, in their country they were stuck in where we were in the 1970s and 1980s. The idea that people have free will, and then any kind of causes or factors that impact behavior is just a myth, or a way to get out of criminal responsibility. So we were really, really tough on crime, particularly in the 1980s going on. But now we're starting to recognize that there are things that impact people's behavior that make them not fully responsible for it, perhaps. So they wanted me to explain this to their audience, this theory, to kind of demonstrate how we're not necessarily 100% responsible for our behavior. There's things beyond our control that affect us, right? So they asked me to talk about it. They followed me around. It was like a celebrity. It was crazy. I'm at this conference with thousands of people, and I've got a camera crew following me everywhere. Very strange. But it was fun. But they asked me if I could simplify it. So I took out a piece of paper and a pen. They're filming me, and I'm writing it down. And I'm just trying to break it down to make it more simple to understand. So second version that you see is actually what sort of happened in that experience when I was writing it down on paper. So you'll see it's slide number 13 if you pull it up. The first slide shows how your brain is created. Genes interacting with the environment leads to your brain, and that alone, as I talked about, that alone can lead to antisocial behavior, abnormal hormones, neurotransmitters, and enzymes, right? But then I said, but there's also factors in the environment that affect your brain too. So they said, for example, like what I said, like parenting. So you'll see the next slide, number 14. It shows the different ways that parenting affects the child of a brain. So how much you're attached to your children, how much you love them, how you discipline them, whether it's violent or nonviolent, consistent or inconsistent, what food you feed them, that's the nutrition effect. And then we also talked about how being a good parent, you can direct your children to appropriate friends, peers, right? Or you can tell them you don't like who they're hanging out with. So your parents affect your brain by determining who you hang out with to some degree. All of those things from parenting also affect the behavior of the child through their brain, right? It affects their brain, which then leads to behavior. What else? Go to the next slide. The neighborhood that they live in, that's called community characteristics. So we talked about social disorganization in chapter 8, for example. Being in a socially disorganized neighborhood makes it harder to be a good parent. We talked about that, right? That's sort of the definition of social disorganization. So living in poverty, for example, or a very diverse neighborhood where you don't know people, that makes it harder to be a good parent, which then affects the brain of the child, affects their behavior. Continuing on, what's called the full model in slide 16 shows that those institutional problems, going off to the right there, to your right, committing antisocial behavior leads to problems at school, leads to problems at work, leads to problems in relationships at home, etc., which means antisocial behavior is likely to continue. And social disorganization, we know, affects those things too. It affects the relationships you're in, the type of work you have, the type of school you're in, etc. So this is meant to be a simplified version of the original theory. Okay, and it just basically it leaves a lot of things out, but that's okay. It's actually, if you look at the two together, the original theory and this one, it's saying the same thing, but a slightly different way. Okay? All right. So then you'll see some more reactions just for fun, saying what a great theory this is and what criminologists think about it. You know, again, just kind of fun. But then something really cool happened. The theory got tested for the first time. This is very difficult to do, to come up with a data set, numbers on genetics, the brain, parenting, all these kinds of things that have to be measured to test this theory. Well, there are data sets like this. And there was a criminology student at Florida State, where I got my PhD so many years ago, working with Kevin Beaver, who's a professor there, who's also the co-author of the book now, second edition. So under the direction of Kevin Beaver, she tested this theory. And I'm not surprised she found significant evidence, because that is true, because the theory is based on the evidence we already have, things we know that are true. So you'll see the test, it's slide number 20, okay? You can actually click on it and look at the actual test itself, the document. But you'll see the different risk factors that she looked at, this grad student, doctoral student at Florida State. So there's some brain factors, genetic factors, maternal risk factors, like whether the mother drank, used drugs, genetic risk, deviant peers, socioeconomic status, school attachment, neighborhood disadvantage. So she was saying, is there a relationship between these things and different outcomes like drug abuse, violent crime, property crime? And you'll see 9 hypotheses, okay? And these are things that are tested. So these are propositions or predictions, hypotheses about what she expected to find. And you'll see specifically the things she looked at that flow right from the book, you know, chapter 3 with genetics, chapter 7 with parenting, chapter 8 with low income, etc. Genetic risk, interactions between genetic risk and environmental factors, which is what integrated systems says. Genes interact with the environment. All these things she tested. And you'll see on slide number 22 some of her conclusions. And basically, what she's saying is that she found consistent evidence with the major predictions of integrated systems theory. Okay, brain development plays a major role in behavior. Environmental effects plays a big role, specifically deviant peers and school attachment play a big role in antisocial behavior. Gene-environment interaction plays a role. But you see, direct genetic effect failed to display predictive power. Well, that's because, remember, genes don't cause anything. They make things more or less likely, but they depend on the environment. So this is exactly what integrated systems says. And then she continues on the next slide with their overall analysis conclusion, saying integrated systems theory represents an important contribution to criminological theoretical literature, should be utilized by researchers in the study of human behavioral development. That's her way of saying that her dissertation highly supported the predictions of the theories, like you'd expect, based on the fact that the theory is based on all the research that other people have already done. It's just putting it all together. Now, based on her test, I decided to produce a new version of the theory to try to make it even simpler. So the last parts of the slide show the same kind of idea, but just stated in a slightly different way, okay? The third version of the theory says the same thing, and you can flip through this. There's several slides. One deals with childhood and how behavior is initiated or started. The next one deals with adolescence, and this deals with whether behavior is continued or not. So if you commit antisocial behavior as a child, whether you continue depends on other things in the environment. Then you'll see adulthood as well. And each of the figures, each of the arrows in these figures are numbered, and what those numbers mean are explained, are explained in the PowerPoint slideshow, okay? So if you have any questions about those, let me know. The final slide shows you how different risk factors affect you over the course of your life. So not everything affects you at the same time. So there are some things that affect you in the womb and after birth, right, as a small child. There's some things that affect you later in childhood. There's other things that affect you in adolescence. And then there's other things that are more likely to affect you in early adulthood, right? So integrated systems is sensitive to that reality. So to summarize, what we're seeing is integrated systems theory is built on everything we know from criminology and criminal justice, from all the theories we talked about and that are written about in your book, puts them all together in a new way to show the relationship between all these factors, and now is being tested, is being supported. Now, in terms of crime prevention, ideally you can use this to stop crime. If you know what the risk factors are for antisocial behavior, then you just reduce people's exposure to it. Pretty simple. Well, easy to understand, not easy to do. And if you know what the protective factors are that make crime less likely, then you try to increase people's exposure to them. Again, easy to understand, not necessarily easy to do. But that's what crime prevention comes down to, eliminating risk factors and increasing protective factors. All of that comes from integrated systems perspective and integrated systems theory, meaning we can prevent a lot of crime if we actually use data, numbers, science, as opposed to just police, courts, and corrections, which those are obviously very necessary for public safety. But we're not going to get a huge crime prevention impact from those unless we start addressing the known risk factors and protective factors that on the one hand make crime go up and on the other make it go down. Okay, this is a quick summary of chapter 10. Your final exam date is announced already on your As You Learn page. Your final exam study guide is also there. That exam will be open from 8 a.m. to 8 p.m. and you'll have about 2 hours to do it, as usual. If you have any questions, the best thing to do is to reach out to me and ask them. We can Zoom together, or you can just email me, what have you. I will definitely respond as soon as possible. I wish you the best of luck. Remember that your final exam is worth 30% of your final grade. So take it seriously, study. If you have any questions, let me know. All right. Talk to you guys soon. Peace.